The fine arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew immediately something was wrong because it was addressed to me in bold red letters with the words "Violation Notice" stamped across the envelope. I stood in my kitchen in Buffalo, New York, staring at the paper with my coffee going cold in my other hand. According to the document, I owed the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association $500 for missing the mandatory winter meeting that had been scheduled for January 15th. The date rang a bell immediately because that was the day the worst blizzard of the season had hit our area, closing every major road in Erie County and leaving us all trapped in our homes for nearly 3 days. My name is Isaac Anderson, and I have lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. I bought my modest 2-story colonial when I moved here for work, thinking it would be a quiet place to settle down. The HOA seemed reasonable at first. The fees were not outrageous, the rules made sense, and the president, a woman named Patricia Miller, seemed professional enough during our initial meeting. But Patricia retired last year, and the new president was someone I should have been more concerned about from the start. Karren Vance took over the HOA presidency with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found their true calling in life. She was a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair that she kept in a severe bob, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck like some kind of authority badge. From day one, she made it clear that things were going to change under her leadership. Suddenly, we had mandatory meetings every quarter instead of twice a year. Fines started appearing for violations I had never heard of before. Someone got fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street 15 minutes past the allowed time. Another neighbor was cited for a lawn ornament that was apparently not on the approved list. I tried to stay out of Karen's way, keeping my head down and following the rules as best I could. My job as a software developer kept me busy enough that I did not have time or energy for HOA drama. But this fine was different. This was not about a rule I had accidentally broken or a guideline I had misunderstood. This was about something completely beyond my control. I pulled out my phone and found the text message Karren had sent to the entire neighborhood on January 14th, the day before the meeting. It read, "Reminder, mandatory winter meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. All homeowners must attend. No exceptions. Failure to attend will result in fines as per bylaw 7.3. I remembered seeing that message and feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The weather forecast had been dire all week. Every meteorologist in western New York was warning about the incoming storm system. By January 14th, the National Weather Service had already issued a blizzard warning for our entire region, effective from 6 p.m. on January 15th through the morning of January 17th. I had replied to Karen's message, along with several other neighbors, pointing out the weather warnings and suggesting we postpone. Her response had been curt. "The meeting will proceed as scheduled. Plan accordingly." The morning of January 15th, I woke up to find my driveway already buried under 8 inches of snow, and it was still coming down hard. The wind was howling so loudly it sounded like a freight train outside my windows. I checked the news and saw that the governor had declared a state of emergency. All non-essential travel was banned. The roads were officially closed. I had taken photos and screenshots of everything. The weather alerts on my phone, the news broadcasts, the official Erie County road closure notifications. I even had footage from my doorbell camera showing the complete whiteout conditions outside my house at 7 p.m., the exact time the meeting was supposed to start. Armed with all this evidence, I decided to call Karren directly. I found her number in the HOA directory and dialed, expecting maybe an apology or at least an acknowledgement that the fine was a mistake. She answered on the third ring. Karren Vance speaking. Hi, Karren. This is Isaac Anderson from 42 Maple Drive. I just received a fine for missing the winter meeting, but I'm sure you remember the roads were completely closed that day because of the blizzard. There was a pause, and then she said in a tone that made my blood pressure rise. The meeting was mandatory, Mr. Anderson. We clearly stated there would be no exceptions. But the governor declared a state of emergency. Travel was literally illegal. I made it to the meeting, she said, as did 7 other responsible homeowners. If we could manage to attend, so could you. I felt my jaw tighten. You live 3 houses down from the community center. I live on the opposite end of the neighborhood. That's over a mile in blizzard conditions on closed roads. Lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay. Good day, Mr. Anderson. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, amazed at the audacity. This was not just unreasonable. This was insane. I spent the rest of the day researching HOA laws in New York State. I learned that while HOAs have significant power, they still have to operate within certain legal boundaries. They cannot enforce rules that require residents to break the law, and traveling during a state of emergency with closed roads was definitely breaking the law. I also found that HOA boards have a duty to act reasonably and in good faith. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal appeal letter. I included printouts of the weather warnings, the road closure notices, the state of emergency declaration, and photographs showing the conditions outside my home at the time of the meeting. I explained calmly and professionally why the fine was unjust and requested its immediate dismissal. I submitted the appeal through the proper channels, following the procedures outlined in our HOA bylaws. According to the rules, the board had to review appeals within 14 business days and provide a written response. 2 weeks later, I received their response. It was a single page, signed by Karren Vance, stating, "Appeal denied. The board finds no merit in your claim. The fine remains in effect. Failure to pay within the original 30-day window will result in additional late fees and potential legal action." I called an emergency meeting with some of my neighbors. There were 5 of us gathered in my living room. Myself, Tom Richards from next door, Elena Martinez from across the street, Robert Chen from 2 blocks over, and Sarah Williams from the corner house. We all had our own stories of increasingly ridiculous fines and violations under Karren's leadership. Tom had been fined for parking his work truck in his own driveway because it had his company logo on the side, which Karren claimed was commercial advertising not allowed in the neighborhood. Elena had received a violation notice for painting her front door navy blue instead of the approved shade of blue from the HOA paint palette. Robert was being threatened with fines because his teenage son's basketball hoop was apparently 6 inches closer to the street than regulations allowed. Sarah had been cited for having wind chimes that were deemed excessive noise. "This is getting out of control," Elena said, shaking her head. "My door color looks identical to the approved shade. I even have the paint receipt showing it's from the approved manufacturer." "I checked the bylaws," Robert added. "There's nothing specific about basketball hoop placement. She's making up rules as she goes." Tom leaned forward in his chair. "What can we actually do about this? She's the HOA president. She has the board backing her up." I had been thinking about this question for days. We have options. First, we can request a special meeting of all homeowners to address these concerns. If enough people vote, we can remove her from the board. Second, If she's enforcing rules that don't actually exist or fining people for things beyond their control, that might be grounds for legal action. Sarah looked worried. Legal action sounds expensive. It might not come to that, I said, but we need to document everything. Every unfair fine, every unreasonable demand, every time she makes up a rule that's not in the actual bylaws. If we can show a pattern of abuse of power, we'll have a strong case. We spent the next hour going through our experiences and creating a shared document of all the issues. The list grew disturbingly long. Karren had been president for only 14 months, but in that time, she had issued over 60 violation notices to homeowners in our 150-home neighborhood. Before her tenure, the HOA averaged maybe 10 violations per year, and those were usually for genuinely problematic issues like houses falling into disrepair or people running actual businesses out of their homes. I volunteered to draft a petition for a special meeting. According to our bylaws, if 20% of homeowners signed the petition, the board was required to hold a meeting within 30 days. 20% meant we needed 30 signatures. Getting those signatures proved easier than expected. I spent the next week going door to door, explaining the situation and showing people the documentation we had compiled. Many homeowners had their own stories of Karren's overreach. Some had paid fines just to avoid the hassle, even when they felt the violations were unfair. Others had been living in fear, afraid that any small mistake would result in a citation. By the end of the week, I had 43 signatures. I submitted the petition to the HOA board, keeping copies of everything for my records. Karren's response came via email to all the petitioners. She acknowledged receipt of the petition and scheduled the special meeting for March 3rd, about a month away. But her email also included a thinly veiled threat. The board reminds all homeowners that frivolous complaints and attempts to undermine HOA authority may themselves be considered violations of community standards. Is she seriously threatening us for exercising our rights? Elena said when I showed her the email. That's exactly what she's doing, I replied. And honestly, that might work in our favor. The more unreasonable she acts, the stronger our case becomes. But Karren was not done. A few days after I submitted the petition, I received another notice from the HOA. This one informed me that my property had been inspected and found to have multiple violations. According to the notice, my mailbox was faded and needed repainting. My lawn had bare patches that needed to be reseeded. My gutters appeared to have leaves in them, and my house numbers were not the approved font. Each violation carried a $50 fine, totaling $200 on top of the $500 I supposedly owed for missing the winter meeting. The notice stated that if the violations were not corrected within 2 weeks, daily fines of $25 each would begin accruing. I went outside and looked at my property with fresh eyes. My mailbox was perfectly fine, barely 3 years old with no visible fading. My lawn did have a few bare spots, but it was February in Buffalo, New York. Everyone's lawn looked rough this time of year. My gutters had maybe 3 leaves in them at most, hardly a violation. And the house numbers thing was particularly absurd because I had not changed them since I bought the house 5 years ago. If they were not the right font, why was this suddenly a problem now? I took photographs of everything and added this latest incident to our growing documentation. It was obvious what Karren was doing. She was retaliating against me for organizing the petition. This was textbook harassment. Tom came over that evening and saw the violation notice on my kitchen table. He let out a low whistle. "She's really going after you." "Yeah," I said. "But she's making a mistake. This is too obvious. Anyone can see this is retaliation. You should talk to a lawyer, Tom suggested. This is beyond normal HOA stuff now. He was right. The next morning, I called a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Jessica Thornton, and she agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Attorney Thornton's office was in a renovated brownstone in downtown Buffalo. She was a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. I spent an hour going through everything with her, showing her all my documentation. She listened carefully, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and nodded. "You have a strong case, Mr. Anderson. Multiple strong cases, actually. First, the fine for missing the mandatory meeting during a state of emergency is clearly unenforceable. No court would uphold that. Second, this pattern of retaliation is potentially actionable. And third, if she's enforcing rules that don't exist in your actual HOA bylaws, that's a breach of her fiduciary duty." "What are my options?" I asked. "Well, the special meeting you've organized is a good first step. If you can get her removed from the board, that solves a lot of problems. But given her behavior, I doubt she'll go quietly. You should be prepared for her to fight this. In the meantime, I can send a letter to the HOA board on your behalf, outlining the legal issues and demanding that all fines against you be dismissed. That might make them think twice about pursuing this. And if it doesn't, then we file suit. We can sue the HOA for harassment, for breach of contract, and for violations of New York HOA statutes. We can also seek an injunction preventing them from assessing any further fines against you while the case is pending." I authorized her to send the letter. It felt good to finally have professional help dealing with this situation. Attorney Thornton's letter went out the next day via certified mail. It was 3 pages of detailed legal argument, citing specific statutes and case law. The conclusion was clear. The fines against me were without merit and needed to be withdrawn immediately, or the HOA would face legal consequences. I expected some kind of response, but I did not expect what actually happened. 2 days after the letter was sent, Karren called an emergency board meeting. She sent out a notice to all homeowners stating that the board had become aware of a coordinated effort to disrupt community harmony and would be taking appropriate measures to protect the neighborhood. The emergency meeting was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening. I attended along with about 50 other homeowners, a much larger turnout than usual. The community center's main room was packed, with people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. Karren sat at the front table with the other 4 board members: Linda Shaw, the vice president, Michael Thompson, the treasurer, Patricia Kim, the secretary, and David Foster, the member at large. Karren called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared statement. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. The board has called this meeting to address a serious situation. As many of you know, certain residents have been questioning the board's authority and refusing to comply with community rules. This behavior threatens the integrity of our neighborhood and the property values we all depend on." She paused for effect, looking around the room. I noticed several people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "The board takes its responsibilities seriously," Karren continued. "We enforce the rules fairly and consistently. When homeowners violate those rules, there are consequences. That is not harassment. That is not abuse of power. That is simply good governance." I raised my hand. "Can I respond to that?" Karren's expression tightened. "This is not a question and answer session, Mr. Anderson. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which our bylaws say govern our meetings, any homeowner has the right to speak during the open forum portion of a meeting," I said calmly. I had spent the last few days reading up on parliamentary procedure. Several people murmured in agreement. Karren looked like she wanted to argue, but Linda, the vice president, leaned over and whispered something to her. Karren's lips pressed into a thin line. "Very well," she said tersely. "You may speak. 2 minutes." I stood up so everyone could see me. "Thank you. I want to address what Karren just said about enforcing rules fairly and consistently. I was fined $500 for missing the mandatory winter meeting on January 15th. That was the day of the blizzard. The roads were officially closed. The governor had declared a state of emergency. Traveling was illegal. I pulled out my phone and held up a photo of the road closure notification. This is from the Erie County Department of Transportation. It clearly shows that all roads in our area were closed at the time of the meeting. I could not attend because doing so would have required me to break the law. Yet Karren insisted the fine was valid because she and a few others who lived close to the community center were able to walk there. More murmuring from the crowd. I could see people nodding. "Since then," I continued, "I've been hit with additional fines for violations that either don't exist in our bylaws or are completely subjective. My mailbox is supposedly faded, even though it's only 3 years old. My lawn has bare spots, which is normal for February in Buffalo. And apparently, my house numbers are the wrong font, even though I've never changed them and they've been fine for 5 years. I looked directly at Karren. "This isn't about enforcing rules. This is about punishing me for organizing a petition to address HOA overreach. And I'm not the only one being targeted. Many of you in this room have similar stories." Karren stood up abruptly. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Anderson. Do you have any proof of this alleged targeting?" "I do, actually." I held up a folder. "I have documentation of every fine issued under your presidency compared to the 3 years before you took office. The difference is stark. I also have records showing that most of the violations you've cited are for rules that don't appear anywhere in our actual bylaws." The room erupted in conversation. People were talking over each other, some agreeing with me, others calling out their own experiences. Karren banged her gavel. "Order, this meeting will come to order." It took several minutes for the room to quiet down. When it finally did, Tom stood up. He did not wait to be called on. "I've been fined for parking my work truck in my own driveway," he said. "Karren says it's commercial advertising. But I've read the bylaws 3 times now. There's no rule against work vehicles. The only thing the bylaws say is that you can't run a business out of your home that generates significant traffic or noise. I'm a plumber. My truck stays parked in my driveway when I'm not working." "How is that a violation?" Elena stood up next. "My front door is supposedly the wrong color. I have the receipt showing I used paint from the approved manufacturer in an approved shade of blue. But Karren says it's too dark, and I need to repaint it with a different shade at my own expense." One by one, more homeowners stood up and shared their experiences. Robert talked about the basketball hoop. Sarah mentioned her wind chimes. A man I did not know well, James Porter, said he had been fined because his Christmas lights were still up on January 10th, even though the bylaws said they could stay up until January 15th. Karren tried to maintain control, but it was clear she had lost the room. People were angry, and they were finally voicing complaints they had been holding back for months. Finally, Linda, the vice president, stood up. She looked uncomfortable. "Karren, I think we need to table this discussion and have the board meet separately to review these concerns." There seemed to be some legitimate questions about how we've been applying the rules. Karren turned to her sharply. "We have been applying the rules correctly. These homeowners simply don't want to follow them. But some of the things people are describing aren't actually in the bylaws," Linda said quietly. "I've been reviewing the documents and there are discrepancies." This was interesting. Linda had been on the board for years, even before Karren became president. If she was questioning Karren's interpretation of the rules, that carried weight. Michael, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "I have to agree with Linda. We should review this more carefully before proceeding with any enforcement actions. Some of these fines might not be appropriate." Karren looked around at her fellow board members with barely concealed fury. "Are you all questioning my leadership?" David, the at-large member, spoke up. "We're not questioning your leadership, Karren. We're questioning whether we've been correctly applying the community bylaws. That's our responsibility as board members." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Karren tried to adjourn, but several homeowners objected and demanded votes on various motions. It became clear that Karren had lost control of both the board and the community. After 2 hours of heated discussion, the board agreed to suspend all pending fines pending a full review of the bylaws and enforcement procedures. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. It seemed like people were finally seeing what I had been dealing with. But I also knew Karren well enough by now to understand she would not give up easily. I was proven right the next morning when I found a notice taped to my front door. It was not an official HOA document. It was a handwritten note on Karren's personal stationery. It read, "You've made a serious mistake, Mr. Anderson. You will regret undermining this board. I will make certain of that." I immediately took a photo of the note and sent it to Attorney Thornton. Her response came within an hour. "This is beyond inappropriate. This is potentially criminal harassment. Keep the original note and document any further contact. We may need to involve the police." The special meeting we had petitioned for was now less than 2 weeks away. In the meantime, life in the neighborhood became increasingly tense. Karren seemed to be everywhere, watching, taking notes, looking for violations. She would drive slowly through the streets with her car window down, photographing people's homes. She started showing up unannounced at properties, claiming she needed to inspect for violations. When she appeared at my house one afternoon, I was ready. I had my phone set to record audio. She knocked on my door and I opened it but stayed in the doorway. "Karren, what can I do for you?" "I'm here to conduct an inspection of your property," she said, holding a clipboard. "Do you have an appointment?" I asked. "I don't need an appointment. As HOA president, I have the authority to inspect any property for compliance. Actually, according to our bylaws, you need to provide 24 hours written notice before conducting an inspection, except in cases of emergency." "Is there an emergency?" Her jaw tightened. "Your repeated violations constitute an ongoing emergency." "That's not what the bylaws mean by emergency. I'm not consenting to an inspection today. You can schedule one with proper notice if you feel it's necessary." "You're obstructing official HOA business," she said, her voice rising. "I'm following the procedures outlined in our bylaws. If you'd like to discuss this further, please contact my attorney." I handed her one of Jessica Thornton's business cards that I had been keeping handy. Karren snatched the card and glared at me. "You think a lawyer scares me? I'll have you out of this neighborhood within 6 months. Your property will be in foreclosure for unpaid fines, and there's nothing you can do about it." "Are you threatening me?" I asked calmly. "I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions," she said. "Choose wisely, Mr. Anderson." She turned and walked back to her car. I immediately sent the audio recording to Attorney Thornton. Her response was immediate and firm. "We need to file for a restraining order. This has gone beyond HOA disputes. This is harassment and potentially witness intimidation given your upcoming special meeting. I'm also recommending you file a police report." I took her advice. That afternoon, I went to the Buffalo Police Department's local precinct and filed a report. The officer who took my statement, Officer James Martinez, was sympathetic but realistic. HOA disputes are tough, he said. Usually they're civil matters, not criminal. But based on this recording and the note she left, there might be grounds for harassment charges. We'll investigate and follow up. The police report got Karren's attention in a way nothing else had. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, not Karren personally. The letter stated that the board had reviewed the fines against me and had decided to dismiss them in the interest of community harmony. It made no admission of wrongdoing and included language about how the board reserves the right to enforce community standards in the future. It was a partial victory, but not enough. The fines against me were dismissed, but what about everyone else? And what was to stop Karren from doing this again to someone else? The special meeting finally arrived on March 3rd. The community center was packed beyond capacity. Every homeowner in Meadowbrook Hills seemed to be there, along with several attorneys. Jessica Thornton attended with me. The local news had even gotten wind of the situation, and a reporter from the Buffalo News was present. Karren called the meeting to order, but her usual authoritarian demeanor was subdued. She must have known what was coming. I stood up during the open forum and made my case. I laid out everything that had happened over the past 14 months. I presented documentation showing that Karren had issued fines for violations that did not exist in the bylaws. I showed the pattern of retaliation against homeowners who questioned her authority. I played the recording of her threat at my doorstep. When I finished, I made a formal motion. I move that Karren Vance be removed as president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, effective immediately, due to abuse of power, harassment of homeowners, and violation of her fiduciary duties. The motion was seconded by Tom. According to our bylaws, such a motion required a 2/3 vote of all homeowners present. Karren tried to argue against the motion, but her words rang hollow. She claimed she had been trying to maintain standards and protect property values. She said I was exaggerating and that the recordings had been taken out of context. She even tried to paint herself as the victim, claiming she had been subjected to unfair attacks for simply trying to do her job. But the evidence was overwhelming. When the vote was called, the result was decisive. Out of 127 homeowners present, 104 voted to remove Karren from the board. It was not even close. Karren sat in stunned silence as the votes were tallied. When the final count was announced, she stood up slowly, gathering her papers. Her face was red and her hands were shaking. "You're all making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership. Your property values will plummet, and when that happens, don't come crying to me." She stormed out of the community center, leaving her fellow board members sitting at the table looking relieved. Linda Shaw, the vice president, assumed the role of acting president. Her first motion was to suspend all pending fines pending a comprehensive review by the board and a newly formed rules committee. The motion passed unanimously. After the meeting, several homeowners came up to thank me. Some were people I barely knew, but they had been suffering under Karren's regime in silence, afraid to speak up. Elena hugged me. Tom shook my hand firmly. Even some of the board members, freed from Karren's influence, expressed their gratitude. The reporter from the Buffalo News interviewed me outside the community center. I kept my comments measured, focusing on the importance of HOAs operating fairly and within the bounds of their actual authority. The story ran 2 days later with the headline, "Buffalo HOA President Ousted After Homeowner Revolt." I thought that would be the end of it. Karren was gone, the fines were dismissed, and the neighborhood could return to normal. But I underestimated Karren's vindictiveness. A week after her removal, I received a lawsuit notice. Karren Vance was suing me personally for defamation, claiming that my statements at the special meeting had damaged her reputation. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I showed the lawsuit to Attorney Thornton. She read through it carefully and then actually laughed. "This is a slap suit," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's suing you to punish you for speaking out. New York has anti-slap laws. We can get this dismissed fairly quickly, and we can counter-sue for attorney's fees." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, worried about legal bills. "Don't worry about that yet. Given the circumstances and the fact that this is clearly retaliation, I'm willing to work with you on fees. Plus, if we prevail on the anti-slap motion, she'll have to pay your legal costs. She's making a big mistake filing this." Attorney Thornton filed a motion to dismiss under New York's anti-slap statute. The motion argued that my statements at the HOA meeting were protected speech on a matter of public concern, and that Karren could not prove actual malice or false statements since everything I said was documented. The hearing on the motion was scheduled for early April. Karren showed up with her own attorney, a stern-looking man named Richard Blackstone who had a reputation as an aggressive litigator. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Maria Rodriguez, a no-nonsense jurist with over 20 years on the bench. She listened to arguments from both sides and then asked Karren's attorney a pointed question. "Mr. Blackstone, can you point to any statement made by Mr. Anderson that was factually false?" Blackstone shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, the defendant made numerous inflammatory statements that damaged my client's reputation in the community." "That's not what I asked. Were any of his statements false? Yes or no?" He characterized my client's actions in a misleading way. "Did he lie? Did he make up facts? Did he knowingly say things that were untrue?" Blackstone hesitated. The manner in which he presented the information was designed to inflame and embarrass my client. Judge Rodriguez looked unimpressed. "Mr. Blackstone, New York law protects citizens who speak out on matters of community concern, especially regarding their own HOA. Unless you can show that Mr. Anderson made false statements with actual malice, this lawsuit has no merit. I'm granting the motion to dismiss. Furthermore, I'm awarding attorney's fees and costs to Mr. Anderson. Your client will be responsible for paying his legal bills." Karren looked like she had been slapped. She started to stand up, but her attorney grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. "Your Honor, we request leave to appeal," Blackstone said. "You can appeal if you want," Judge Rodriguez said. "But I'm telling you now, you won't win. This is exactly the kind of lawsuit our anti-slap laws were designed to prevent. Miss Vance, if I may offer some unsolicited advice, move on. You've lost. Continuing to pursue this will only cost you more money and make things worse." The judge's words proved prophetic. Karren did appeal, and the appellate court affirmed the dismissal within 3 months. The appellate decision included a strongly worded opinion criticizing Karren's lawsuit as a transparent attempt to punish a homeowner for exercising his First Amendment rights. By this point, it was summer. The HOA had elected a new board, with Linda Shaw remaining as president and several new members joining. One of their first actions was to review and update the bylaws, removing vague language and clarifying the rules. They also implemented a new appeals process that gave homeowners more protection against arbitrary fines, but Karren was not done yet. If anything, her defeats in the HOA and in court seemed to have pushed her over the edge. She began a campaign of petty harassment that bordered on stalking. She would drive past my house multiple times a day. She would park across the street and sit in her car, watching. She filed complaints with the city about my property, claiming code violations that did not exist. Each complaint required a city inspector to come out, and each time they found nothing wrong. After the fifth frivolous complaint in 2 weeks, the city inspector, a tired-looking man named Dave Wilson, pulled me aside. "Look, I know what's going on here. We've got a file on this Vance woman. She's been filing complaints against several people in your neighborhood. At this point, it's harassment. You should file for a restraining order." I took his advice. With Attorney Thornton's help, I filed for an order of protection. The hearing was scheduled for mid-July. At the hearing, I presented evidence of Karren's behavior. The multiple drive-bys documented by my doorbell camera, the frivolous city complaints, her continued presence near my property despite having no legitimate reason to be there. I also brought up the threatening note and the recorded conversation. Karren represented herself at this hearing, having apparently parted ways with her attorney after the failed defamation suit. She tried to argue that she had every right to drive on public streets and that filing complaints with the city was her right as a citizen. Judge Thomas Brennan, who presided over the restraining order hearing, was not sympathetic. "Miss Vance, there's a difference between exercising your rights and using those rights to harass someone. The pattern of behavior here is clear. You're not just driving on public streets. You're repeatedly parking outside Mr. Anderson's home with no legitimate purpose. You're not filing legitimate complaints. You're weaponizing city resources to harass a neighbor." "He destroyed my reputation," Karren burst out. "He turned the entire neighborhood against me. Someone needs to hold him accountable." "He exercised his rights as a homeowner," Judge Brennan said firmly. "Multiple courts have now found that his actions were appropriate and lawful. Your continued targeting of him is not. I'm granting the order of protection. You are to stay at least 500 feet away from Mr. Anderson and his property at all times. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly. You are not to file any further complaints against him with any government agency unless you have clear evidence of an actual violation. Violation of this order can result in criminal contempt charges. You understand?" Karren's face had gone pale. She nodded stiffly. "I need a verbal response," the judge said. "Yes," she said through clenched teeth. "I understand. I thought this would finally be the end." Karren had lost at every turn. She had been removed from the HOA board, lost her defamation lawsuit, been ordered to pay my legal fees, and now had a restraining order against her. Surely she would give up, but I had underestimated how deep her obsession went. What happened next shocked everyone in the neighborhood. It was early August, about 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I immediately knew something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while looking out my window. In the dim light from the street lamps, I could see a figure in my backyard. They were spray painting something on the side of my house. My heart was pounding as I stayed on the line with the 911 operator, describing what I was seeing. "Officers are on their way," the operator said. "Stay inside and away from windows." The police arrived within 5 minutes. I heard shouts and then silence. A few minutes later, an officer knocked on my door. When I opened it, Officer Martinez was standing there, the same officer who had taken my original harassment report months ago. "Mr. Anderson, are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. Did you catch whoever was out there?" "We did." "You're not going to believe this, but it was Karren Vance. We caught her red-handed with spray paint on her hands. She was painting profanities on your house." I felt a mix of vindication and disbelief. She violated the restraining order. She sure did. And she's going to be charged with criminal mischief, vandalism, violation of an order of protection, and possibly stalking. This is serious, Mr. Anderson. She's looking at potential jail time. I went outside with the officer to survey the damage. In red spray paint, Karren had written several vulgar insults across my garage door and the side of my house. It was going to cost hundreds of dollars to clean up and repaint. Karren was arrested that night. The next morning, her mugshot was in the local news. The headline read, "Former HOA president arrested for vandalizing homeowners' property." The story included background on our entire conflict, painting Karren as someone who had become increasingly unstable after losing her position of power. Several other neighbors came forward with their own stories of Karren's harassment, not just of me but of others who had voted to remove her. Karren's arraignment was set for the following week. I attended, wanting to see this through to the end. She appeared before Judge Patricia Henderson with a public defender, having apparently run out of money for private attorneys. The prosecutor outlined the charges and the evidence. They had Karren on camera from my doorbell footage. They had the spray paint cans found in her car. They had her violating a clear restraining order. The case was airtight. Karren's public defender tried to argue for leniency, claiming his client had been under extreme stress and had suffered mental health issues related to her removal from the HOA board. The prosecutor argued that this was not a one-time lapse in judgment, but part of a months-long pattern of escalating harassment. Judge Henderson listened to both sides and then addressed Karren directly. "Miss Vance, I've reviewed the history of this case, including the restraining order hearing and the prior litigation. You have been given multiple opportunities to move on from this situation. Instead, you chose to escalate your behavior to criminal activity. This court takes violations of protective orders very seriously." She sentenced Karren to 6 months in jail, with the possibility of early release after 3 months for good behavior. She also ordered Karren to pay restitution for the damage to my property and to undergo mandatory mental health counseling. Karren broke down crying as the sentence was read. Part of me felt sorry for her. Whatever had driven her to this point, whether it was a need for control or some deeper psychological issue, it had destroyed her life. But mostly, I just felt relief that it was finally over. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal over the following months. The new HOA board operated transparently and fairly. Fines were rare and only issued for legitimate violations. Meetings were scheduled at reasonable times with proper notice and provisions for rescheduling due to weather or emergencies. Tom's work truck remained in his driveway without issue. Alina's navy blue door was admired by neighbors. Robert's son continued to play basketball. Sarah's wind chimes tinkled peacefully in the breeze, and my house numbers, in whatever font they were, stayed exactly as they had been. I eventually received a check from Karren's insurance company covering the cost of repairs to my house, plus the legal fees the courts had awarded me. Attorney Thornton sent me a final bill that, after the court awards and insurance payments, actually resulted in a small refund to me. "You should frame this," she said when she sent me the final accounting. "It's rare that someone who fights back against HOA overreach actually comes out ahead financially." Karren was released from jail after serving 4 months. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of Meadowbrook Hills, selling her house and relocating to somewhere in Pennsylvania. She was required to continue counseling as part of her probation, and the restraining order remained in effect for 3 years. I ran into Linda Shaw, the current HOA president at the grocery store in December, almost a year after the original Blizzard meeting. We chatted about the neighborhood and how things had improved. "You know," Linda said, "I wanted to apologize. I was on the board when Karren was president. I should have spoken up sooner about some of the things she was doing. I just didn't want to cause conflict." "I understand," I said. "It's hard to stand up to someone in authority, especially when they're as forceful as Karren was. Still, you did the right thing, and you paid a price for it. The neighborhood is better because you were willing to fight." As I drove home that day, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been an exhausting year, filled with stress and conflict I never wanted. But it had also been a lesson in the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and costly. The whole situation had started with something as simple as a fine for missing a meeting during a blizzard. A fine that was so obviously unjust it should have been dismissed immediately. But Karren's refusal to back down, her insistence on asserting authority even when it was clearly wrong, had revealed a deeper problem. She had not been interested in serving the community. She had been interested in control and power. When people are given positions of authority in organizations like HOAs, they need to exercise that authority responsibly and with humility. They need to remember that they serve the community, not the other way around. And when they forget that, when they start viewing homeowners as subjects rather than neighbors, that's when problems begin. I also learned about the importance of documentation and knowing your rights. If I had not kept detailed records, if I had not researched the laws and bylaws, if I had not been willing to seek legal help, Karren might have succeeded in her campaign of harassment. Many people in similar situations simply pay unfair fines or tolerate unreasonable rules because fighting back seems too hard or too expensive. But as my experience showed, sometimes fighting back is necessary. And sometimes, when you stand up, you discover that many others were waiting for someone to take that first step. The winter that followed was much quieter than the previous one. When January 15th came around again, the anniversary of the Blizzard meeting, the HOA sent out a notice for the annual winter meeting scheduled for mid-February. The notice included a line that made me smile. "In the event of severe weather, this meeting will be rescheduled. The safety of our homeowners is our top priority." I attended that meeting, along with most of the neighborhood. We discussed routine matters like the budget, landscaping plans for the common areas, and maintenance schedules. There were no threats, no unreasonable fines, no arbitrary enforcement of made-up rules. It was boring in the best possible way. As I sat in the community center that evening, surrounded by neighbors who were engaged in civil discussion about our shared community, I realized that this was what an HOA was supposed to be. Not a tool for one person's power trip, but a democratic organization focused on maintaining and improving the neighborhood for everyone's benefit. After the meeting, I walked out into the cold February evening feeling content. The parking lot was clear, the roads were safe, and I was heading home to my house with its 3-year-old mailbox, its winter rough lawn, and its house numbers in whatever font they happened to be. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, I hoped Karren Vance had found peace and was learning to let go of the need for control that had caused so much damage. Whether she had or not, it was no longer my problem. My battle was over, and I had won not just for myself, but for every homeowner who had suffered under her regime. The lights of Buffalo twinkled in the distance as I drove home, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had stood up to an HOA bully, fought through the legal system, and come out the other side with my rights intact and my neighborhood improved. It had not been easy, and there had been times when I wondered if it was worth the fight. But looking back, I knew I would do it all again. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when the alternative is allowing injustice to prevail. The fine for missing a meeting during a blizzard had been wrong, and I had been right to challenge it. Everything that followed had been a natural consequence of that initial stand. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, I felt grateful. Grateful for good neighbors, for a fair legal system, for judges who saw through frivolous lawsuits, and for the opportunity to make a difference in my community. The whole ordeal had taught me that ordinary people can fight back against unreasonable authority and win. And that, in the end, was the real lesson of the whole situation. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining neighborhoods and protecting property values. But they must operate within the law, treat homeowners fairly, and remember that they exist to serve the community, not to dominate it. When they forget that basic principle, homeowners have the right and the responsibility to hold them accountable. The snow fell softly on Buffalo that night, covering everything in a clean white blanket. It was peaceful and quiet, the kind of winter evening that made me remember why I had chosen to live here in the first place. And as I settled into my warm home, I knew that whatever challenges might come in the future, I had proven to myself that I could face them. The story of my fight with Karren Vance and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New homeowners would hear about it and express amazement that such a thing had happened here. Longtime residents would shake their heads and talk about how crazy that year had been. For me, it eventually became just another chapter in my life, an interesting story to tell but not something I dwelled on. I continued my work as a software developer, maintained my home, participated in community events, and lived my life. The HOA functioned quietly in the background, as it should, addressing real issues when they arose but otherwise staying out of everyone's way. And on snowy winter days, when the roads got bad and travel became dangerous, I would look out my window and remember that night during the blizzard when Karren had expected everyone to risk their safety to attend a meeting. I would remember the absurdity of being fined for following the law and protecting myself from danger. Those memories reminded me of an important truth. Sometimes the most unreasonable demands reveal the deepest problems. Karren's insistence that I should have attended a meeting during a blizzard was not really about that one meeting. It was about her need to assert total control, to ensure that everyone bowed to her authority, no matter how unreasonable her demands. When someone in a position of power refuses to accept reasonable limitations on that power, when they insist on obedience even when their commands are dangerous or impossible to follow, that is, when concerned citizens must push back. Not because they want conflict, but because allowing such behavior to continue unchallenged leads to greater abuses down the line. My experience also taught me about the importance of community. I could not have succeeded in removing Karren from power on my own. It took dozens of neighbors coming together, sharing their stories and standing united. That collective action was what ultimately made the difference. As the years passed, Meadowbrook Hills became known as a well-managed neighborhood with a fair and reasonable HOA. Property values did increase, not because of strict enforcement of arbitrary rules, but because people wanted to live in a community that respected its residents and operated transparently. The irony was not lost on anyone. Karren had claimed that strict enforcement was necessary to protect property values and community standards, but the opposite proved true. Once we removed her and her oppressive rules, once we focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement, the neighborhood thrived. I never saw Karren again after her release from jail, and I was fine with that. I bore her no ill will at that point. She had paid a steep price for her actions, losing her position, her reputation, her money, and her freedom. I hoped she had learned from the experience and found a way to live a peaceful life somewhere else. As for me, I continued to live in my house on Maple Drive, enjoying the quiet pleasures of homeownership without the constant stress of HOA harassment. I never took for granted the simple freedom to park in my driveway, paint my door whatever approved color I preferred, or miss a meeting when severe weather made travel dangerous. Those basic rights, which should never have been questioned in the first place, had become precious to me precisely because I had been forced to fight for them. And in fighting for them, I had discovered a strength I did not know I possessed, and had helped create positive change for an entire community. The blizzard that had started everything became a distant memory, but its lessons remained fresh. Stand up for what is right. Document everything. Know your rights. Seek help when needed. And never underestimate the power of citizens working together to hold their leaders accountable. These were simple truths, but they had proven crucial in my battle against HOA overreach. And they remain relevant for anyone dealing with similar situations, whether involving an HOA, a landlord, an employer, or any other authority figure who abuses their power. My story had a happy ending, but I knew that many others in similar situations were not so fortunate. Some homeowners paid unfair fines because they could not afford to fight. Some suffered harassment in silence because they did not know their rights. Some watched their neighborhoods deteriorate under poor HOA leadership because they did not know how to organize effective opposition. To those people, I would say this: you have more power than you think. The law protects homeowners from many forms of HOA abuse. You have the right to see the bylaws, to attend meetings, to vote, to petition for change. Use those rights. Document everything. Find allies among your neighbors. And if necessary, seek legal help. The cost of fighting may seem high, but the cost of not fighting is often higher. Unfair fines accumulate. Harassment continues. Quality of life deteriorates. And the injustice spreads as the abusers grow bolder with each unchallenged transgression. My fight against Karren Vance and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA was worth every moment of stress, every dollar spent on legal fees, every hour spent documenting violations and organizing neighbors. Because at the end of it, I lived in a better community. I had protected not just my own rights, but the rights of all my neighbors. And I had proven that ordinary citizens can hold authority figures accountable when they abuse their power. The snow continued to fall on Buffalo that evening, as it had fallen during the blizzard that started everything. But now I watched it from my warm home with a sense of peace and satisfaction. The battle was over. The victory was won. And life in Meadowbrook Hills had returned to what it should always have been. A quiet neighborhood where people lived their lives, respected their neighbors, and worked together for the common good. That was the real happy ending, not the drama of Karren's downfall or my legal victories, but the simple restoration of a normal, healthy community. And it made every moment of the struggle worthwhile.